Before wisdom was written in clay, before kings raised walls of mud brick, before the first city knew its own name, there was wind moving between heaven and earth. Not the wind that bends grain or troubles water. Not the gust that carries dust across empty plains or fills the sails of river boats. Something older. Something that came before breath itself. A presence without form. A voice without sound. The space where all things might begin or end. The darkness before the world had no edges. No up or down. No separation between what might be sky and what might be ground. Everything pressed together in a silence so complete that even silence had no meaning. There was no ear to hear it. No mind to know it. Only the weight of everything touching everything else, compressed into a singularity of being. And then, movement. Not sudden. Not violent. But inevitable, like the first crack in ice when winter begins to release its grip on the river. Something shifted in that compressed totality. Something that would not remain still. In the tongue of those who lived in the land between two rivers, in the language scratched into wet clay and baked hard under the merciless sun, this movement had a name. This presence that could not be held or grasped or understood. This force that separated what had always been joined. Enlil. Lord of the breath between worlds. The God who stood where sky and earth could not meet. The one who held them apart with the simple fact of his existence. There was a time, though time itself had barely begun, though the sun had not yet traced its first path across an empty sky, when heaven and earth lay pressed together in an embrace that knew no ending. An Enki. Sky Father and Earth Mother. Their bodies merged so completely that no light passed between them. No space existed for seed to sprout or star to shine. The cosmos lay dormant in that union, held in a stasis that might have continued forever. But forever is not the nature of things. Even gods must yield to what must be. Enlil came into that darkness. Not born from a womb. Not fashioned by careful hands. Not called into being by another's will. He simply was. Present, as wind is present when a door opens into nothing. As breath is present in the moment before words are spoken. As space is present between one heartbeat and the next. He stood, though standing implies ground beneath and sky above, and neither yet existed, in the compressed totality of an Enki's embrace. And he knew, with a knowing that required no thought, no deliberation, no consultation with powers that might have counseled otherwise, that this could not continue. The separation began slowly. Or perhaps it happened in an instant. Time had no meaning yet, so both could be true. Enlil placed himself between an Enki. Between father and mother. Between what was above and what was below. And with a force that required no anger, no struggle, no explanation, he pushed. Heaven felt it first. The pressure. The insistence. The unyielding presence that would not be denied. And, vast and dark and infinite, began to rise. Not willingly. Not with understanding or cooperation. But rising nonetheless, because Enlil's presence left no other possibility. Earth felt the absence. Key deep and solid and eternal, began to fall. Or perhaps heaven rose while earth remained still. Or perhaps both moved, each drawn away from the other by the expanding presence between them. The stories do not say. The stories cannot say, because there were no witnesses yet. No eyes to see. No minds to comprehend. What the stories do say is this: the first light appeared in that moment. Not the light of sun or moon or stars, those would come later. But the light of separation itself. The revelation that one thing could be distinct from another. That space could exist between bodies. That distance was possible. Enlil stood in that distance. That gap. That wound in the fabric of compressed being. And as heaven rose higher and earth sank deeper, the distance grew. The wound widened. Light poured through it like water through a broken dam. And in that light, the first sound was heard. Not a voice. Not a word. But the sound of air rushing into emptiness. The sound of wind filling a space that had never known wind before. The breath of separation itself, sighing through the cosmos like the exhalation of something too vast to name. Enlil remained there. Permanent. Unmovable. The breath that keeps all things separate. The god of the middle realm. The Lord of Lil, the word that means wind and air and spirit and breath and the space where authority dwells. All of these meanings contained in a single syllable. All of them true at once. This was not creation through love. Not the careful shaping of a potter's hand, pressing clay into form with gentle fingers. Not the nurturing warmth of a mother bringing forth life. This was separation. Division. The first law written into the fabric of things, written not in words but in the structure of reality itself. Above and below must not touch. What is must be held in its proper place. Order must stand where chaos once rested. The gods who came after, and there were many, born from the separated bodies of an Anki, emerging into the light and space that Enlil had created, understood what this meant. They felt it in their bones, in whatever substance divine bones are made of. Enlil had not asked permission. He had not sought approval from an Orki. He had not convened a council or debated the merits of separation versus unity. He had simply done what was necessary. And in doing so, he claimed something that could not be taken back, could not be shared, could not be disputed. Authority. Not the authority of the strongest hand, though Enlil's strength was beyond measure. Not the cunning of the cleverest mind, though his understanding encompassed the workings of the cosmos. But the authority of the one who maintains the structure of reality itself. The one who holds the sky from falling. The one whose presence prevents the world from collapsing back into the undifferentiated darkness of before. The other gods felt this when they gathered in the halls of heaven. When they assembled to decide the fates of cities or the courses of rivers or the outcomes of battles. They felt the weight of Enlil's presence like a heaviness in the air before a storm. Not threatening. Not aggressive. Simply there. Undeniable. Absolute. When Enlil walked among them, they lowered their eyes. Not in fear, exactly, though fear was part of it. But in acknowledgement. In recognition of what he was. The God who could not be challenged, because to challenge him would be to challenge the separation of heaven and earth itself. to question whether the sky should remain above and the ground below, to suggest that the fundamental order of existence might be negotiable. It was not negotiable. When Enlil spoke, and he did not speak often, did not waste breath on unnecessary words or idle conversation, the other gods listened. They inclined their heads. They weighed his words with the seriousness such words deserved. Not because they loved him, not because he had won their loyalty through kindness or gift-giving or the warm bonds of fellowship, but because his word carried the weight of cosmic law. Because what Enlil decreed became part of the structure of what was real and what was possible. The tablets were his. The tablets of destiny. Not physical objects, though the humans would later imagine them as such. Not slabs of lapis lazuli inscribed with cuneiform script, but something older and stranger. The decrees that held the cosmos in its pattern. The invisible architecture of what must be. The framework upon which reality hung like fabric on a loom. These tablets, these decrees, these laws, determined everything. Which rivers would flow and which would run dry. Which cities would rise to greatness and which would crumble to dust. Which kings would sit on thrones and which would die in obscurity. The patterns of stars across the night sky. The cycle of seasons. The inevitability of death. All of it written, in a sense, on tablets that existed beyond writing. All of it sealed with Enlil's authority. On the earth below, in the land between the two great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, flowing from the mountains in the north down to the bitter waters of the southern sea, the humans built cities. Slowly at first. Small settlements of mud brick houses clustered around wells and canals. Then larger. More ambitious. Walls rising higher. Temples reaching toward the sky. And in one city above all others, they built Enlil's temple. Nippur. The name itself was ancient when the oldest surviving records were written. A city that claimed no great king. No conquering army. No vast wealth of gold or grain. But it held something more important than any of these. It held the Eka. The mountain house. The temple of Enlil, lord of wind and fate. The temple rose from the flat plain like a mountain rising from the sea. Mud brick led upon mud brick, each course carefully measured and blessed before the next was laid. Cedar beams brought from distant forests in the north, carried by river and canal and the backs of laborers who sang work songs in languages half forgotten. The outer walls whitewashed and gleaming in the harsh sunlight. The inner chambers dark and cool and silent. The priests of the Eka understood their role. They were not intermediaries, not in the way priests of other gods might be. They did not carry prayers from humanity to Enlil or blessings from Enlil to humanity. They were maintainers, keepers of sacred space, guardians of the silence that Enlil required. They rose before dawn, when the world was still caught between night and day, between darkness and light. They washed in water drawn from the sacred well. They dressed in clean linen robes, white as the temple's outer walls. They spoke in whispers if they spoke at all, their voices no louder than the rustle of wind through palm fronds. They moved through the outer courts where merchants and petitioners gathered, where the noise of human commerce and human need created a constant murmur. They passed through successive chambers, each one quieter than the last. Each one darker. Each one closer to the heart of the temple where Enlil's presence dwelt. The inner sanctum was silent. Not the silence of an empty room. Not the mere absence of sound. But a silence that had weight and texture. A silence that pressed against the ears like deep water. A silence that seemed to extend backward and forward in time, connecting this moment to all the moments before the world began and all the moments that would follow after it ended. The priests made their offerings in this silence. Grain placed on altars of stone worn smooth by centuries of such offerings. Oil poured into bronze vessels that gleamed in the dim light of clay lamps. The smoke of incense, frankincense and myrrh and rare resins brought from distant lands, rising in thin columns toward the ceiling, toward the sky beyond, toward the realm where Enlil maintained his eternal vigil. They did not pray for blessings. They did not ask for favors. They did not expect answers or visions or signs. They simply maintained the relationship between earth and heaven. They acknowledged, through these physical acts, that the order of the world depended on something beyond human understanding or control. That the wind between heaven and earth required recognition. Required its portion. Required the silence it had always required. And Enlil, in his chamber at the heart of the temple, or perhaps in the realm beyond the temple, in the space between earth and sky that no mortal could reach, remained still. He did not need their love. He did not require their understanding. What he required was their acknowledgement of what was. That he stood between heaven and earth. That his will determined the shape of fate. That the tablets upon which destiny was written bore his seal and no other. Kings came to Nippur to receive his blessing. They came with gifts and tribute and elaborate processions. They came with promises to maintain his temple and enlarge his cult. They came seeking the legitimacy that only Enlil could provide. Because a king who ruled without Enlil's favor was simply a man with an army. But a king who ruled with Enlil's blessing, whose name was written, so to speak, on those invisible tablets of destiny, was something more. Was part of the cosmic order itself. The priests would receive these kings in the outer courts. They would perform the rituals that had been performed for centuries. They would speak the words that had been spoken since the first priest walked these halls. And sometimes, not always, not predictably, but sometimes, there would be a sign. A gust of wind through a chamber where no wind should blow. A lamp flame that flickered in a certain pattern. A sudden certainty in the king's heart that his reign would endure or would not. Enlil did not need to appear. Did not need to speak with a voice that could be heard. His presence was the answer. His silence was the decree. And the kings would leave Nippur knowing, in whatever part of their being registered such knowledge, whether they had the god's favor or merely his tolerance. The humans did not always understand this. They wanted reasons. They wanted to know why one city prospered while another starved. Why one harvest was abundant and the next failed. Why their children lived or died. Why their enemies triumphed or fell. They wanted a God who explained himself, who laid out cause and effect in terms they could grasp, who rewarded the virtuous and punished the wicked with some comprehensible logic. But Enlil was not that God. He was the wind that blows where it will, for reasons the wind does not share. The storm that arrives without warning, that destroys without malice and spares without mercy. The silence that falls after disaster, when all questions seem foolish and all answers inadequate. Inevitable. Indifferent. Absolute. And so the humans adapted, as humans do. They learned to live with uncertainty, to make their offerings and maintain their rituals and hope that this would be enough. To accept that some questions have no answers, or that the answers exist in a language they cannot speak, in a script they cannot read, on tablets they can never see. Time passed. Seasons cycled. Generations rose and fell like waves on the shore of an endless sea. And then came the time of noise. It began slowly, imperceptibly. A gradual accumulation that no single person would have noticed in their lifetime. But Enlil noticed. In the space between heaven and earth, where the god of wind maintained his vigil, he heard the sound of humanity growing. At first it was distant. A murmur beneath the threshold of awareness, like the sound of the sea heard from far inland. The voices of farmers in their fields, merchants in their markets, children at play in dusty streets. The sound of hammers shaping copper, of looms weaving cloth, of songs sung at festivals and prayers whispered in the dark. But humanity had learned to survive, had learned to irrigate the desert and store grain against famine and build cities that could withstand siege. Their numbers grew, each generation larger than the last, each city more crowded, each settlement spreading further across the land. And the sound grew with them. Years passed. Decades. Centuries. The murmur became a constant hum. The hum became a roar. Voices layered upon voices layered upon voices. The crying of infants and the laughter of children and the arguments of adults and the wailing of mourners and the chanting of priests and the shouting of merchants and the singing of workers and the barking of dogs and the bleating of sheep and the creak of wagon wheels and the splash of water drawn from wells and the crack of whips and the ring of hammers and the endless, endless, endless noise of living. It rose through the layers of the world like heat from a fire. It penetrated the earth and the air and the space between. It reached the place where Enlil stood, between earth and sky, and it did not stop. It surrounded him, pressed against him, filled the silence he had maintained since before time began. The god of wind and silence found himself drowning in noise. This was not anger that stirred in him. Not in the beginning. Not rage in the way mortals understand it, hot and reactive and personal. Enlil did not take offense. Did not feel insulted. Did not experience the petty resentments that govern mortal relationships. He simply recognized a problem in the order of things. An imbalance. A violation of the structure he maintained. Humanity had grown beyond its proper bounds. The earth was no longer quiet. The separation of heaven and earth, that fundamental divide he had created, that essential distance, was being violated. Not by physical intrusion, but by sound itself. By the accumulated noise of mortal existence pushing upward into realms it did not belong. He called a council. The great gods assembled in the halls of heaven. They came from their various domains and responsibilities. Anu, the distant sky father, whose authority had passed to Enlil in the separation but who remained the nominal head of the pantheon. Enki, the god of wisdom and sweet water who dwelt in the Abzu, the deep reservoir beneath the earth where all rivers are born. Ninhursag, the mother of living things, who shaped creatures from clay and breathed life into them. Others whose names carried weight in the cosmos, whose domains touched mortal lives in countless ways. They sat in the divine assembly. They looked to Enlil, who stood rather than sat, who remained always in that posture of holding apart, of maintaining separation. He spoke quietly, his voice like wind through an empty temple, like the sound of air moving through vast spaces where nothing else exists. The noise of humanity, he said, had become unbearable. It disturbed the peace of the gods. It rose like smoke into places it did not belong. It violated the proper order of the cosmos. Something must be done. The gods listened. Some had heard the noise themselves, though perhaps they had not minded it as Enlil did. Some found it pleasant, in its way, the evidence of abundant life, of civilization flourishing, of their temples being filled with worshippers. But they understood the weight of his words. They felt the fundamental truth he was expressing. When the God who holds heaven and earth apart says that balance has been lost, the matter is not trivial. There was discussion. Gentle at first. Enki suggested that perhaps humanity could be taught to be quieter. Ninhursag argued that the noise was simply evidence of life's vitality, and life was sacred. Other gods offered other perspectives, each colored by their own domains and concerns. But Enlil was unmoved. The noise was not a minor inconvenience. It was a symptom of deeper imbalance. Humanity had exceeded its proper place in the cosmic order. They had grown too numerous, too loud, too present. They needed to be reduced. Returned to appropriate proportion. He decreed a plague. Not as cruelty. Not as vengeance. Not as punishment for some moral failing. But as correction. As adjustment. As the restoration of balance. The way a gardener thins seedlings so the remaining plants can grow properly. The way a shepherd culls the herd to match the available grazing. The plague descended upon the earth like fog settling into valleys at dawn. Silent. Invisible. Inescapable. It moved through the cities and villages, through the reed houses by the marshes and the mud brick compounds of the wealthy. It touched the young and the old, the strong and the weak, without pattern or preference. People woke with fever. Their skin grew hot as sun-baked clay. They shivered despite the heat. They cried out for water but could not drink. They looked at their families with eyes that no longer recognized familiar faces. And then, after days or hours or sometimes mere moments, they died. The living buried the dead in pits outside the city walls. They wept and tore their garments and asked their gods why this had befallen them. But the gods, most of them, had no answer. Or rather, the answer was one the mortals could not hear. That the cosmic order required this. That balance demanded sacrifice. That some distances must be maintained, and if noise threatened that distance, noise must be reduced. Many died. Thousands. Tens of thousands. The streets grew quieter as the population diminished. The markets had fewer voices calling out their wares. Fewer children played in the dust. Fewer songs rose from the beer houses at night. The noise diminished. The roar became a hum. The hum became a murmur. And in the space between heaven and earth, where Enlil maintained his eternal vigil, the silence returned. Not complete, but sufficient, tolerable, within acceptable bounds. The plague lifted as mysteriously as it had come. The fever released its grip on the remaining sufferers. The disease simply stopped. And the survivors, weak and grief-stricken and reduced in number, began the slow process of recovery. They buried their dead. They rebuilt their households. They resumed their lives with the dogged persistence that characterizes human existence. And, being human, they had children. They raised families. They taught their trades and skills to the next generation. The cities began to fill again. Slowly at first, but filling nonetheless. Years passed. The memories of the plague faded into stories told by grandparents. The population grew. New voices joined the chorus of human noise. The markets bustled again. The streets filled with the sounds of commerce and conflict and celebration. And the noise rose. Through the earth, through the air, through the space between. It accumulated year by year, generation by generation, until once again it reached the place where Enlil stood. Until once again it surrounded him. Until once again the silence he maintained was violated by the accumulated sound of mortal living. He decreed a drought. The rains that should have fallen in their season did not fall. The clouds that should have gathered in the mountains remained scattered and thin. The snow that should have melted and fed the rivers stayed locked in ice. The Tigris and Euphrates, those twin arteries that fed civilization, began to shrink. Their waters withdrew from the irrigation canals. The fields that had been green with barley and wheat turned brown. The crops withered. The grain stores, full from previous harvests, began to empty. Famine walked among the people like an unwelcome guest that would not leave. It came first to the poor, to those who had no reserves of grain or oil. They grew thin. Their children cried with hunger that could not be satisfied. They sold their possessions for food, first their luxuries, then their tools, then themselves and their children into servitude. Then famine came to the wealthy. To those who had thought themselves protected by their stores of grain and their walls and their connections to power. They watched their stores dwindle. They made hard choices about who would eat and who would not. They learned that wealth means nothing when there is nothing to buy. People died more slowly this time. Starvation is not quick like plague. It hollows you out gradually. Takes your strength first, then your hope, then your life. The cities grew quieter as the population dwindled. The streets had fewer footsteps. The markets had fewer vendors. The temples had fewer worshippers, or more, depending on how you measured. More desperate prayers. Fewer offerings of substance. And again, the noise diminished. The constant hum of human activity fell to a whisper. In the space between heaven and earth, Enlil found the silence he required. The rains returned. Eventually. Not because Enlil relented, exactly, but because the purpose had been served. The balance had been restored. The population had been reduced to sustainable levels. Humanity recovered. Slower this time. Weaker. More cautious. But they recovered nonetheless. They planted when the rains came. They irrigated carefully, mindful of the water's preciousness. They rationed and stored and prepared against future disaster. And they had children. Because humans have children. Because life continues. Because the alternative is extinction, and something in the human spirit refuses extinction with every fiber of its being. The population grew. The noise grew. The cycle prepared to repeat itself. But Enlil, god of law and order, recognized something the mortals could not. That isolated measures would not suffice. That plague and drought might reduce the population temporarily, but humanity always recovered. Always rebuilt. Always grew back like grass after fire. They did not learn. They could not learn, perhaps. They simply continued being what they were, alive, proliferating, noisy, persistent, ineradicable. A permanent solution was required. He made a final decree. A flood. Not a local rising of the rivers. Not a seasonal overflow that deposited fertile silt on the fields. Not an inconvenience or a disaster or even a catastrophe in the normal sense of those words. But a flood that would cover the earth. Water to reclaim the land from which it had been separated. To wash the world clean of the infestation of human noise. To return the earth to the silence that had existed before the first city was built. Before the first word was spoken. Before humanity learned to shape the world to its will. The other gods heard this decree and felt its weight. Some protested, gently. Questioned whether such absolute measures were necessary. But Enlil's authority in such matters was beyond dispute. He was the god who maintained cosmic order. If he said that order required the erasure of humanity, then the erasure of humanity was what order required. The decree was made. The rains would come. Not next season or next year, but soon. When Enlil willed it. When the cosmic order demanded it. And when they came, they would not stop until the work was complete. Until every city was drowned. Until every voice was silenced. Until the earth was quiet again. The gods dispersed from the council. Each to their own domain. Each carrying the knowledge of what was coming. Most accepted it. Some mourned it, in their way. One decided to act. In the deep waters beneath the earth, in the Abzu where sweet water gathers in the darkness before it rises to springs and wells and rivers, Enki heard the decree and felt troubled. Enki, who was clever where Enlil was firm. Who saw possibilities where Enlil saw necessities. Who loved complexity and contradiction and the beautiful strangeness of things that should not work but somehow did. He had helped to shape humanity, in some accounts. Had mixed his blood with clay to give them intelligence. had taught them arts and crafts and the secrets of civilization. He did not love them as a father loves children. Gods do not love in such simple ways. But he found them interesting, valuable, worth preserving. But he could not oppose Enlil directly. One does not stand against the God who holds the cosmos in place. One does not argue with wind or debate with the law of gravity. Enlil had decreed the flood. The flood would come. This was as certain as the fact that sky and earth remained separate. So Enki did what wisdom does when confronted with immovable law. He moved around it. He found the space between the words of the decree. The gap that exists in all law, no matter how absolute it appears. There was a man named Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise. Perhaps a king. Perhaps a priest. Perhaps simply a man who paid attention to the world around him. Who noticed patterns. Who understood that the gods' actions, though beyond mortal comprehension, still left traces that could be read by those with eyes to see. Enki went to this man's home. A modest house of mud brick like countless others in the city. Reed matting on the floors. Clay vessels for water and grain. An altar in the corner where the household gods received their offerings. Nothing special. Nothing that would mark it as the site of cosmic intervention. But Enki did not speak to Atrahasis directly. That would have been defiance of Enlil's decree. That would have been opposition to cosmic law. Instead, Enki did something stranger. Something that honored the letter of the decree while violating its spirit. He spoke to the wall of the man's house. He stood there, a god in the darkness, and addressed the mud brick as if it could hear. As if it could understand. And perhaps, in some sense, it could. Perhaps the world itself is more alive than mortals realize. Perhaps everything listens, in its way. He told the wall that a flood was coming. He described it in detail. The rains that would fall without ceasing. The rivers that would overflow their banks. The waters that would rise higher than the highest hills. He told the wall that everything on earth would die. Every man, woman, and child. Every animal that walked or flew or crawled. Everything would be drowned in the waters of cosmic correction. But then, and this was the crucial part, the gap in the law where wisdom could operate, he told the wall how to survive. Build a boat, he told the wall. Not a river boat or a fishing vessel, but something larger. Something that could withstand the violence of waters that covered the world. He gave measurements. Length and width and height. He specified the materials. The type of wood to use. How to seal the joints with pitch so no water could enter. How to construct multiple decks to hold everything that would need to be saved. Bring your family, he told the wall. Bring the seed of all living things. Pairs of every animal. Stores of grain and oil and beer. Everything needed to preserve life beyond the flood. To carry the essence of the world through the waters and into whatever would come after. And Atrahasis, lying on his sleeping mat in the darkness, pretending to sleep while a god spoke to his wall, listened. He heard every word. He understood, with the wisdom that had earned him his name, what was being offered to him. A chance. A gap in the decree. a way to survive what should not be survivable. When morning came, he began to build. His neighbors thought him mad, thought the heat had touched his mind. Why build a boat in the middle of the city, far from any navigable water? Why construct something so large for no apparent purpose? Why waste resources and time on a project that made no sense? But Atrahasis did not explain, did not argue, did not try to convince anyone else to build their own boats. He simply worked, day after day, following the specifications he had heard spoken to his wall. He shaped the wood. He sealed the joints. He constructed the decks and the chambers and the doors that would hold back the waters. His family helped, though they did not entirely understand why. His sons cut timber. His wife wove rope. His daughters gathered pitch from the places where it bubbled up from the earth. They worked because he asked them to, because he was the head of their household, because he had never led them wrong before. When the boat was finished, he gathered animals, 2 of every kind, or perhaps 7 of some kinds. The stories differ on this point, and perhaps the exact number does not matter. What matters is that he brought aboard the seed of all living things, the essence of biodiversity, the raw material from which the world could be remade. He loaded grain and oil, beer and dried fish, everything his family would need to survive for however long the waters lasted. He made the boat ready. He sealed the doors with pitch from the inside. And then, with his family and the animals secure in the wooden chambers, he waited. The rains began. Not gradually. Not with warning drops or darkening skies or the smell of moisture on the wind. One moment the sky was clear. The next, it opened like a wound and water poured forth. This was not rain in any normal sense. Not drops falling from clouds, but water descending in sheets, in columns, in a solid mass that seemed to have no spaces between the drops. The sky became water. The air became water. Everything above the earth transformed into a single, falling ocean. And from below, the fountains of the deep burst forth. The waters that Enki guarded in the Abzu, the sweet water that fed springs and wells, erupted upward. The ground split. Geysers of water shot into the air. Rivers reversed their courses and flooded backward from the sea. The canals overflowed first. The irrigation channels that fed the fields filled and spilled over their banks. The water spread across the land like spilled oil, covering the crops, surrounding the houses, rising inch by inch toward the city walls. The people ran to higher ground, to the temples, to the ziggurats that rose above the plain. They carried their children and their valuables and whatever they thought might save them. They crowded onto rooftops and platforms and watched the water rise. It did not stop rising. The fields disappeared. The roads disappeared. The lower sections of the cities filled with water, brown and churning and full of debris. Furniture floated past. Clay tablets. The bodies of animals that had drowned in the sudden deluge. The people on the rooftops prayed. They called to their gods. They made promises and pleas and desperate bargains. They wept and shouted and, eventually, fell silent as they watched the water continue to rise. The rooftops went under. The platforms. The ziggurats. Even the highest structures built by human hands vanished beneath the surface. The cities, those monuments to human noise and ambition and defiance of the desert, disappeared as if they had never been. The temples where incense had burned and offerings had been made for centuries became home to fish and silence. The water rose higher. It covered the hills. It covered the mountains. It covered everything that was not sky. The world became an ocean with no shore. A single, unbroken surface stretching to every horizon. And in that ocean only one thing floated. Only one vessel carried life through the waters of annihilation. Atrahasis's boat. Inside, in the darkness, for there were no windows, only the sealed wooden walls, the family huddled together. They listened to the rain hammering against the hull. They felt the boat rock and heave on the waves. They heard the animals calling to each other in confusion and fear. They rationed their food and water and waited in the darkness while the world drowned. Days passed. Or weeks. Time had no meaning in the darkness. No sunrise or sunset. No way to mark the passage of one day into the next. Only the constant rain and the constant darkness and the constant uncertainty about whether they would survive or whether the boat would break apart and send them tumbling into the depths. The gods themselves grew nervous. They had not anticipated the totality of it. They had approved Enlil's decree, but approving something in council and witnessing its execution are different things. They watched the world vanish beneath the waters. They watched their temples sink. They watched everything they had known and ruled over disappear into the flood. And they retreated to the highest heavens, to the peaks of the cosmic mountains where even the flood waters could not reach. They huddled there, gods huddling like frightened mortals, and wondered what they had done. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The rain continued. The water rose and rose until there was nowhere left to rise to, and then it simply remained, a global ocean suspended between earth and sky, with only Enlil's wind moving across its surface. And in that silence, that perfect, absolute silence, the gods realized something they had not considered. They were hungry. Gods require offerings. Not food in the way mortals need it, not sustenance to keep their divine bodies functioning. But the essence of food, the smoke of sacrifice rising from altars, the libations poured into sacred vessels, the prayers spoken over bread and beer, the acknowledgement, made physical through ritual, that the divine deserved a portion of what the earth produced. For countless generations, these offerings had flowed upward like invisible rivers. From every city, every village, every household altar. The gods had grown accustomed to this nourishment, had come to depend on it in ways they perhaps had not fully recognized until it was gone. With humanity drowned, there were no offerings. No incense burning in temples that now rested beneath fathoms of water. No grain heaped on altar stones. No wine poured into libation bowls. No priests rising before dawn to maintain the sacred relationship between earth and heaven. The silence Enlil had sought was complete. But silence, it turned out, had a price. The gods felt the absence like a physical hunger, a gnawing emptiness that grew day by day. They had not known they needed the offerings until they ceased, had not understood that the relationship between divine and mortal was not one-directional, that worship flowed upward but sustenance flowed back down, that they were bound to humanity in ways that even they had not fully comprehended. Weeks passed in this state. The gods grew weaker. Not dying, gods do not die in the way mortals die, but diminishing, becoming less substantial, less present, as if the lack of acknowledgement from below was causing them to fade from existence itself. Still the rain fell. Still the waters covered everything. Still Enlil's decree held the world in its grip. And then, finally, the rain stopped. Not gradually. Just as it had begun without warning, it ceased without transition. One moment water was pouring from the sky. The next, the clouds broke apart and sunlight that had not touched the earth's surface in months, broke through. The waters began to recede. Slowly. Imperceptibly at first. But each day the global ocean sat a little lower. Each day more of the mountain peaks emerged from the depths. Each day the world remembered, inch by inch, what it meant to have land and sea as separate things. The boat that carried Atrahasis and his family and the seed of all living things rode the receding waters. It drifted without direction, without control, carried by currents that had no pattern because there were no shores to shape them. For days it wandered across the shrinking ocean. Until one morning, and who knows how Atrahasis knew it was morning in the darkness of the sealed boat, they felt something change. Felt a stillness. A cessation of movement. The rocking that had been constant for so long had stopped. The boat had come to rest on something solid. Atrahasis waited. Days, perhaps. Making sure. Then he opened the door, breaking the seal he had placed there so long ago, and looked out at the world. It was not the world he remembered. The cities were gone. The fields were gone. Everything was covered in a layer of mud, thick and grey and lifeless. The boat rested on the side of a mountain that had once been far from any water. The peak stretched above them. Below, the waters still covered everything, but they were visibly lower than they had been. The world smelled of rot, of things that had died and were now decomposing under the mud, of a fundamental wrongness, as if the earth itself was sick from what had happened to it. But the sky was clear. The sun shone. Birds, released from the boat to test the world, flew and did not return, meaning they had found places to land. The waters were receding. Life could begin again. Atrahasis and his family emerged from the boat. They stood on the muddy slope and looked at the emptiness around them. A world scoured clean. A world returned to the silence that had existed before cities rose. Before humanity learned to shape the earth to its will. And Atrahasis, who was exceedingly wise, understood what needed to be done. He built an altar. Not a grand structure of cut stone and cedar beams. Just a simple pile of rocks on the mountainside. He took some of the animals from the boat, some of the precious seed of life that he had preserved through the flood, and he sacrificed them. He built a fire and cooked their flesh. He poured libations of beer and oil onto the stones. And the smoke rose, thin and pale against the blue sky, rising upward into the air, carrying the scent of roasted meat and burning cedar and fermented grain. The gods, huddled in the high heavens, weak from months without offerings, smelled it. The reaction was immediate, visceral. They descended toward the scent like starving people toward food. They swarmed to it, and the stories use that word, swarmed, which is an undignified word for gods but perhaps an accurate one. They gathered around the altar that this lone human had built on the mountainside. They drew in the essence of the sacrifice like breath after drowning. They were desperate. They were hungry. And they were suddenly, shockingly aware that they needed humanity. That the relationship was not one of master and slave, but something more complex, more mutual. That in destroying their worshippers, they had nearly destroyed themselves. Enlil arrived last. He came not in desperation but in his usual measured way. The wind preceding him. The weight of his presence felt before he appeared. He descended toward the altar and saw what the other gods were already consuming. And then he saw the boat, saw the family, saw the animals emerging onto the muddy slope, saw the evidence that his decree, his perfect, absolute decree meant to erase humanity completely, had been circumvented. His anger was not the hot fury of a lesser god, not the shouting and posturing that characterizes divine rage in other mythologies. It was cold, total. The anger of law confronted with its own failure. The anger of order discovering that chaos has found a way to persist despite every measure taken against it. He stood before the altar, and the gods parted before him, their hunger briefly overcome by their fear, and demanded to know how this had happened. How any living thing had survived the flood meant to erase all living things. Who had warned this human? Who had defied the cosmic decree? The other gods were silent. They looked at each other. They looked at the ground. They did not want to be the one to answer. Did not want to be the one to accuse. Did not want to be caught between Enlil's wrath and whatever consequences might follow. And Enki, god of wisdom, stepped forward. He did not apologize. Did not beg forgiveness. Did not show fear or uncertainty. He simply explained, in his calm and reasonable way, that perhaps total destruction had not been the answer. That the problem Enlil had identified was real, humanity's noise, their excessive numbers, their disruption of the cosmic order. But that the solution had been flawed. Humanity, he argued, served a purpose. They maintained the temples. They made the offerings. They acknowledged the divine through ritual and prayer and sacrifice. Without them, the gods themselves diminished. The flood had proven this. The silence Enlil had sought had nearly cost the gods their own existence. Balance, Enki suggested, required both silence and sound. Both order and chaos. Both law and mercy. The cosmos could not function with only one side of the equation. Enlil maintained the separation of heaven and earth, yes. But that separation required both realms to exist. If earth was emptied of all life, what was the point of maintaining the separation? Enlil stood before the smoking altar. before the man who had survived. Before the evidence that his absolute authority could be questioned, could be worked around, could fail to achieve its purpose. And something shifted. Not his nature. Enlil did not become gentle or kind or understanding in that moment. He remained the god of wind and law and the space between heaven and earth. Cold. Distant. Absolute in his authority. But he recognized, as the wind recognizes when it meets an immovable mountain, that absolute order, pursued absolutely, breaks the world rather than preserving it. That there must be limits even to law. That the structure he maintained required some flexibility or it would shatter under its own rigidity. He looked at Atrahasis. At this human who had survived what should not be survivable. Who had heard the warning spoken to a wall and built a boat on dry land and trusted that wisdom would preserve him where law would destroy him. And Enlil made a new decree. Humanity would be allowed to continue. But measures would be put in place to control their growth. Not sudden catastrophes like plague or drought or flood. But woven into the fabric of human existence itself. There would be barren women who could not bear children. Infants who died before drawing their first breath. Children who succumbed to illness before reaching adulthood. There would be celibate priestesses dedicated to temples rather than to childbearing. There would be demons who stole babies from their mothers' arms. Death itself would be woven more thoroughly into the pattern of human life. Not as punishment, but as boundary. As the limit that keeps noise from becoming unbearable. As the force that maintains proportion between what is and what can be sustained. Humanity would live. But it would live within constraints. And it would remember, through stories, through prayers, through the silence they maintained in temples, that they existed at the pleasure of powers they could not comprehend or control. That the God who holds heaven and earth apart had once attempted to erase them. That they survived not through their own strength but through wisdom and divine intervention. That the silence was always there, waiting beneath the noise, ready to reclaim the world if the balance was lost again. Atrahasis and his family were blessed. Granted long life and divine favor. Their descendants would spread across the earth, would rebuild the cities, would restore the temples. The world would be populated again. The noise would return, carefully controlled, but still present. The offerings would flow upward. The gods would receive their portion. The relationship would continue. But it would continue differently. With all parties aware of what had almost been lost. With the understanding that mutual dependence bound them together in ways that pure authority could not sever. The gods dispersed. The waters continued to recede. The earth slowly recovered from its drowning. Mud dried in the sun. Seeds that had somehow survived began to sprout. Animals multiplied. Humanity spread across the land once more. And Enlil returned to his place between heaven and earth. To the space he had created and must maintain for all eternity. To the silence that was his nature and his domain. But there is another story. Quieter. Told in whispers rather than in the grand halls of temples. A story that suggests even Enlil, even the god of cosmic law, was subject to the laws he enforced. This happened long before the flood. In the early days when gods walked more freely between heaven and earth. when the boundaries were newer and perhaps less firmly established. When even the divine could make mistakes that would echo through eternity. There was a goddess. Young. Beautiful. Enlil was her name. Daughter of one of the older gods. She lived in the realm between heaven and earth, as many gods did. She was innocent in the way of those who have not yet learned that innocence can be dangerous. One day she went to bathe in a stream. Not a mortal stream on the earth below, but a divine watercourse that flowed through the realms of heaven. She removed her garments and entered the water. She washed herself in the cool, clear flow. She was alone, or thought she was. She felt safe. Enlil saw her. Desire is a strange thing for a god who maintains cosmic order. Strange and dangerous. Desire implies want, and want implies lack, and lack implies imperfection. The God who holds heaven and earth apart should be complete in himself. Should need nothing. Should want nothing. But he wanted her. He approached the stream. He spoke to her. His words were not recorded, or perhaps they were too private for the stories to preserve. But whatever he said, however he approached her, her answer was clear. No. The young goddess refused the Lord of Wind and Fate. Refused the god whom all others obeyed without question. She told him no and meant it. She left the water. She dressed herself. She walked away. And Enlil, god of law, felt something he had perhaps never felt before. The frustration of denied desire. The humiliation of rejection. The anger of authority challenged by someone who should have submitted without hesitation. He did not accept her refusal. He followed her. He assumed different forms. The stories are unclear on the details, speaking of disguises and deceptions that allowed him to approach her again and again. He spoke words that bent truth without breaking it. He maneuvered and manipulated and pursued her with a single-minded focus that would have been admirable if directed toward any other purpose. And eventually, he took what had been denied to him. Not through physical force, though he certainly had the power for that, but through deception. Through words and forms and circumstances that left Enlil confused about who she was dealing with. Through violations of trust and boundary that were no less violent for being subtle. He raped her. The word is harsh. The stories sometimes soften it, speaking of seduction or trickery or divine privilege. But the essence is clear. She said no. He ignored that no. He took what was not given. He violated her. And in doing so, he violated the law that even gods must follow. Because there were laws for the divine. Rules that govern behavior in the realms of heaven just as Enlil's decrees govern behavior on earth. Rules about consent and violence and the proper relationships between gods. Rules that existed to maintain order among beings of immense power, whose conflicts could tear the fabric of reality. Enlil had broken those rules. The god of law had violated divine law. The maintainer of cosmic order had created chaos. The other gods learned what had happened. Perhaps Enlil told them. Perhaps they saw it with their own divine sight. Perhaps the violation was so fundamental that it created ripples in the structure of reality that could not be hidden. They called a council. the same council where Enlil usually sat in judgment, where his word determined outcomes and shaped destinies. But this time, he was not the judge. He was the accused. They assembled in the halls of heaven. All the great gods. Anu the Sky Father. Enki the Wise. Ninhursag the Mother. Others whose names carried weight. They sat in judgment on Enlil, Lord of Wind and Fate. The trial was brief. The facts were not in dispute. Enlil did not deny what he had done, did not claim exception or privilege, did not argue that his authority placed him above the law he had violated. He stood before the divine assembly and accepted their judgment. They found him guilty. The God of law, guilty of breaking law. The maintainer of order, guilty of creating disorder. The judge, judged. The authority, subject to authority higher than himself. His sentence was exile. Banishment from the heavens to the underworld. To Ker, the place of darkness and dust where the dead go. Where no light shines. Where no wind blows. Where silence is absolute not because of divine decree but because even the dead cannot speak. The God who holds the cosmos in place would descend to the realm of the dead as punishment for his crime. Would leave his station between heaven and earth. Would abandon his post and his authority and his power. And Enlil accepted the sentence. He did not rage against it. Did not call upon his authority to override the judgment. Did not threaten the other gods or attempt to maintain his position through force. He had enforced law for countless ages. He understood that law, to have meaning, must apply to all. Even to him. Especially to him. To claim exception would be to unmake everything he stood for. Would be to admit that law was merely power in disguise. That order was just another name for tyranny. That the structure he maintained was arbitrary rather than absolute. So he accepted exile. Accepted punishment. Accepted the consequence of his action. He descended to the underworld. Down through the layers of reality. Past the realm of heaven where the gods dwelt. Past the realm of earth where humanity lived and died. Down to Ker, the land of no return. The place where the dead gathered in endless twilight, neither living nor truly gone, existing in a state between being and unbeing. And Enlil, pregnant with his child, followed him. Not because she forgave him. Not because she loved him. The stories do not speak of love or forgiveness or any warm emotion that might soften what had happened. She followed him because the child she carried was his. Because the fruit of his crime was also the fruit of divine seed. Because fate, once set in motion, must play out to its conclusion. In the darkness of Ker, Enlil took different forms. He appeared to Enlil as various gatekeepers and guardians of the underworld. He fathered more children on her, 3 more, by most accounts. Children who would remain in the underworld. Gods of the dead places. Deities who would rule over the darkness and dust and silence that characterized the realm of the dead. The stories become unclear here. Confusing. Perhaps deliberately so. Perhaps some things are too strange or too private for clear telling. But through means that the tablets do not fully explain, Enlil was eventually allowed to return to the upper world, to reclaim his place between heaven and earth, to resume his station as Lord of Wind and Fate. But he had been punished, had submitted to law, had accepted exile and carried out his sentence. The god who enforced order had been subject to the order he enforced. And everyone, gods and mortals alike, understood something fundamental from this. That law was not the same as power. That authority could be held accountable. That even the one who maintains the cosmic structure was bound by that structure. Enlil returned to his temple in Nipper, to the Eka where silence dwelt, to the chambers where priests made offerings and kings sought blessings, and the proper relationship between heaven and earth was maintained through ritual and prayer. He resumed his place in the divine councils, spoke his decrees, maintained the separation of above and below, continued being what he had always been, the wind between worlds, the space that keeps all things apart, the law that requires no explanation. But the story remained, whispered in corners, told in private, remembered by those who needed to remember that even absolute authority has limits, that even cosmic law can be broken, that even the God who holds heaven and earth apart once fell and was punished and rose again, changed or unchanged, the stories do not say. The priests who kept these stories did not explain what they meant, did not draw morals or lessons or conclusions. They simply repeated the words that had been repeated to them by those who came before. They lit the incense in the dark temples. They poured the libations. They maintained the silence that Enlil required. And outside the temples, in the cities and fields where humanity had returned after the flood, life continued. The noise continued. The laughter and arguments and songs. The endless, irrepressible sound of living that had nearly cost humanity everything. But it was quieter now, more measured, as if somewhere in the collective memory of the species there remained the echo of absolute silence, the memory of a world drowned, the understanding that the noise they made was permitted, not guaranteed, that the God who had tried once to erase them might try again if the balance was lost. The wind moved through it all, sometimes gentle, sometimes harsh, always present, the breath between heaven and earth, the space where authority dwells. Enlil was not loved as some gods were loved. There are few hymns praising his kindness, few stories of his generosity or warmth or care for mortal concerns. But he was acknowledged, respected, feared in the way that one fears the inevitable, the way one fears gravity or time or death, not as malicious forces but as fundamental aspects of reality that cannot be negotiated with or avoided. Kings still claimed their authority flowed from him. Laws were still written in his name. Cities still rose and fell according to his will, or according to forces that people attributed to his will, which might amount to the same thing. But will is a strange word to use for a god like Enlil. It suggests intention, purpose, the active choice to reward or punish, to elevate or destroy. And perhaps that is not quite right. Perhaps Enlil was more like the wind itself, not choosing where to blow, but blowing nonetheless. not deciding what to knock down, but knocking it down through the simple fact of being wind. Not judging or evaluating or caring, but simply maintaining the structure of reality through his continued existence. A force of nature elevated to divine status. Or a divine force that appears to mortals as nature itself. The distinction might not matter. In the long centuries after these events, after the flood, after the judgment, after the return, the world found a kind of equilibrium. The cities remained. The noise remained. But it was contained. Managed. Kept within bounds that did not disturb the cosmic order too severely. Humanity lived and died and remembered, dimly, that they had once nearly ceased to exist. They made their offerings. They maintained their temples. They spoke prayers in the darkness and hoped they were heard, or hoped they were not heard, depending on what they were praying for. And Enlil remained in his place. Between heaven and earth. In the space he had created when he separated an Anki in the time before time. In the silence that existed before sound and would exist after sound ceased. Unchanging. Eternal. Absolute. Or so it seemed. But nothing is truly eternal. Even gods change, all the world changes around them, all the stories about them change until the original truth is lost beneath layers of interpretation and revision and forgetting. Generations passed. Empires rose in Mesopotamia. Sumer gave way to Akkad. Akkad gave way to Babylon. New gods were worshipped, or old gods were given new names, new attributes, new stories. Marduk claimed authority that had once belonged to Enlil. Other deities absorbed his functions or his temples or his cult centers. The Ika in Nippur fell into disrepair. The priests grew fewer. The offerings became less frequent. The silence in the inner chambers was no longer maintained because there was no one to maintain it. The stories were still told, for a while. Written on clay tablets and stored in libraries. Copied by scribes who perhaps no longer quite understood what they were copying. Preserved as artifacts of an earlier age. And then the libraries burned. Or were buried. Or were simply abandoned when the cities that housed them were abandoned. The tablets were lost. The stories stopped being told. The names of the gods faded from memory. But the wind continued to blow between heaven and earth. It blows still. Across the ruins of Nippur where the Ika once stood. Across the fields that were once crowded with cities. Across the rivers that still flow between their banks, though the people who gave them names are long dead and the civilizations that depended on them are dust. The wind blows without purpose. Without anger. Without mercy. Without awareness that it was once called Enlil and feared by gods and mortals alike. Or perhaps it retained some awareness. Some echo of what it was. Some fragment of divine consciousness distributed across every moving current of air. Perhaps when you feel the wind on your face, any wind, anywhere, you are feeling the breath of the God who separated heaven and earth. The presence of Enlil, still maintaining the gap he created, still holding the cosmos in its proper structure, still being what he has always been. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the wind is just wind. Air moving from high pressure to low pressure. A physical phenomenon with no consciousness, no intention, no divine nature. The stories do not say. The tablets are silent. The temples are ruins. The priests are dead. But the wind blows. And in that wind, if you listen carefully, if you are quiet enough, if you let go of the need to understand or control or name what you are experiencing, you might feel something. A weight. A presence. A sense of something watching from the space between heaven and earth. Not hostile. Not kind. Simply there. Simply maintaining what must be maintained. Simply being what it has always been. The breath between all things. The silence that makes sound possible. The God who separated the world and stands forever in the gap he created. Enlil. Lord of wind. Lord of fate. Lord of the space where nothing and everything meet. The stories ended long ago. The last priest who knew the proper offerings has been dead for millennia. The language in which his hymns were sung is no longer spoken by any living tongue. But the wind did not stop. It moves still across the earth. Through the places where cities once stood. Through the emptiness between stars. Through the gap between one breath and the next. Unnoticed most of the time. Taken for granted. Expected. But still there. Still separating heaven and earth. Still maintaining the order that allows anything to exist at all. Still blowing. Still silent. Still.